I'm going to turn off the Penguins movie in the background so we can concentrate on the text. The title has no animation right now, so I'll twirl down the text section and I can animate almost any property. So let's animate position for starters. And once I create an animator, I can then add a selector called wiggly. The idea behind the wiggly selector is that any value you set for position, scale, or rotation is setting the maximum amount that the characters can wiggle inside of. If I run preview, you can see the characters are going up and down, but using the value I've set as their maximum amount. If I then add rotation, and let's just add a little rotation, now the characters rotate clockwise and counterclockwise, using the value for rotation that I've set as a maximum amount. Now once you apply the wiggly selector, you'll probably find it's just a little too hyperactive. I'll reduce my position value just so it's jumping up and down a little bit, maybe about 50 pixels or so. I'll twirl down the wiggly selector and let's look at the options that we have available. Some of these are far more useful than others. For instance, the wiggles per second, I nearly always reduce that. Let's reduce it to about half, 0.5. Now the characters wiggle up and down much more slowly. Another very useful parameter is correlation. If I set correlation to the maximum, 100%, all of the characters will do exactly the same thing. In other words, they'll animate in unison. But if I reduce the percentage to a value in the 80s or the low 90s, the characters will still look very playful, but they tend to be easier to read. On the other hand, if I reduce correlation to a low number, like 0%, the characters will look as different from each other as possible. The problem now is that the viewer would have a very hard time trying to figure out what you're trying to say. So in general, I tend to increase the correlation to somewhere in the 80s. Some of the other options you may not need to change at all. The mode pop-up defaults to intersect. That simply means that the wiggly selector is intersecting with whatever characters are selected by the range selector. The based on pop-up is set to characters, and that generally looks a little more interesting than words or lines. When I set it to words, all the characters for each word will animate in exactly the same way. So I'll set that back to characters. The temporal phase and spatial phase simply move the wiggle pattern in time or in space. And if you like, you can animate just the temporal and spatial phases and turn the wiggles per second to 0. The next parameter, lock dimensions, is very useful when you're animating scale. You might want the width and height to remain the same. However, if I enable it and wiggle position on both the X and Y axes, the characters will tend to animate on a diagonal. That's because if they wiggle 10 pixels to the right, they must animate 10 pixels down, and so on. So generally speaking, I find if I need to enable lock dimensions for scale, I may need to have two separate animators. One animating position will lock dimensions off, and the second animator animating scale would lock dimensions on. The random seed option is simply a way to scramble the result you're getting. So now that we have some idea how the wiggly selector works, let's add our last property, which is fill color, hue, and we'll increase the hue value. Now you can see each character is taking on a slightly different color. You can set that to taste. Now remember, if your type is white or black, you won't see the color changing. That's why I started with the blue fill color.